All right, awesome. So thank you guys for joining us for the first day of the summer series, talking about growing from food scraps. So let's just jump right in it. Kicking over to the next slide where we have a whole list of things. Some of the things we're going to get into that we're going to talk about directly. And some of these stuff are just really cool stuff. And I think it's really cool to have it all laid out here, especially since some of the stuff kind of directs back to each other. So in the next slide, we're going to be talking about the actual stuff that we're going to be showing you how to grow and how to grow from. So scallions, some fruit seeds, potatoes, garlic, ginger, some herbs, right? And so we're going to be talking about food scraps, which is essentially anything that's on a fruit or a vegetable that you don't or you wouldn't eat. So like the seeds, the roots or the ends or the tops, but we're also going to talk about how to grow stuff from things that are not necessarily food scraps. So anything that you might have laying around the house. And in the next slide here, we're going to talk about some fruit seeds, which I think are really cool and have been developed over time. As you can see here, we have a picture of a pepper. And I know some of you guys are like, Chantel, that's not a fruit. But the definition of what a fruit is has changed over the years. I know definitely since I was in school. And so now it's really classified as anything that is going to develop from the flower plant and contains a seed. So that could include peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, apples, avocados, pumpkins. So it is definitely a blurred line now between what's a fruit and what's a vegetable. So that could be something fun to do to play with your kids.
Yeah, that's always like a fun trivia fact. Like, did you know pumpkins are actually a fruit? And it's interesting because there's one definition if you're talking about the botanical definition, which is what we're doing today, versus like the culinary definition, where a lot of these things you would in the culinary world are considered vegetables. But it is like a funny did you know?
Exactly, Laura. And then we're going to swing over to the next slide where we talk about avocados, which I know are some of you guys' favorite fruit slash vegetable. We're thinking about botanical versus culinary, right? And so the avocado is really cool. I know Laura, I know you had, grown an avocado plant. Do you want to walk us through it a little bit?
Yeah. Well, actually, this one isn't mine. It's my friend's avocado plant. And she started it from here about a year ago. And this is her avocado plant, which she named Alfie. And this is Alfie after 1 year. And so, what you can see here in the picture, the best way to sprout an avocado pit is you want to suspend the bottom half, which is going to be the wider half of the avocado pit. If you really look up close and observe it, you'll see there's one side that's a little broader, a little wider. And that's where you want to encourage the roots to come out of. So you're going to put that half suspended in water. And so you can stick these toothpicks in there in a shallow glass of water. And it can take a while. It can take like anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks. But eventually, what you'll have is the root will kind of break through this pit because it's softened in the water, and the root will come through and start going down. At the same time, or soon after, you'll see a sprout come from the top half. And we don't want to put the whole thing in the water because that'll rot the stem that starts to come out of here. So that's why we suspend it like that. And then once you see that the root starts coming down, that's when you can plant it in some dirt over here. And you want to do the same thing where half of the pit is in the soil and the top half is actually still exposed to air. And so you'll always see a little bit of that pit actually, which is kind of interesting. You don't bury it completely.
Yeah, that was a great tip. I know some of you are probably like, well, I tried to do this and it didn't work. Some easy fails is like not changing the water every couple of days because it gets really gross and then it just won't grow.
Yeah, you always gotta change that water.
Exactly. Or even trying to use an avocado that is not organic because some of the genetically modified ones are not produced to like have to grow seeds. So it's not going to give you a plant, unfortunately. So those are just some things to think about as we move forward, right? And then the next slide is the lemon seed, which is really awesome.
Listen, we're going to add something really quick. I saw
Sure.
you unmute yourself.
Yes, so we have a question about, will this give you an avocado? If you
no.
Yeah, so unfortunately, this is not going to produce fruit. It is a beautiful tropical looking houseplant though. So that's just something to think about.
I mean, we did have some people tuning in from Texas, and so maybe there they would actually be warm enough and humid enough year round for this avocado plant to mature. It will take, I think, like 5 years or some amount of years for it to reach maturity, and then it's always kind of there's no surefire ways that you can guarantee it will produce fruit. So if you really want an avocado tree that will produce fruit, you would need to live in a very hot, humid environment. If you have like a really great greenhouse, that always helps. Or you could just buy a tree that's already mature if you live in a warmer climate, just to ensure that it will produce fruit. But here in New York, we don't grow any avocados for fruits.
Unfortunately not.
But it's beautiful. It's a beautiful house plant.
It is. Yeah, and now we have some lemon seeds that we can grow indoors, which are really cool. And I know, Laura, you actually did do this one. I know that for sure.
This one's mine. I did it. It was one of my quarantine experiments to see if I could grow a lemon tree from a grocery store lemon. And as you can see in this last picture, it did work. It sprouted. And on the topic of like growing tropical plants in New York State, again, this one I'm not expecting to grow any lemons. Although it's a little more likely to get a lemon tree in New York to grow lemons than it is for an avocado tree. So if you want to do what I did here, which is basically a growing experiment to have a new house plant, you can use any type of grocery store lemon. You might need to try a few things first just to make sure that it's not a sterile variety or one that's been modified to be sterile. So what I did to kind of hedge my bets and make sure that I had a better chance of germination is I pre-soaked the lemon seeds to see if any of them would actually start sprouting. And so I put them in a wet paper towel in a Tupperware container, and I kept that paper towel moist for about a week or two. And after that, I saw that at least 1 or 2 of them were sprouting. So I took the one that looked like it had the best chance of sprouting, and I planted it in this shallow hole. I used kind of like a dry potting mix that is meant for like cactus and citrus. And then a week or 2 later, it started to sprout outside of the soil. And so this one, again, I'm not expecting it to produce lemons for me, but I have seen citrus trees growing in New York City in very sunny windowsills. So you don't actually need anything special, but you would want to buy something from a nursery that is a dwarf variety of a lemon tree, or I've seen like a kumquat tree, which was pretty cool in New York City growing. So it kind of just depends on the variety that you get.
Yeah, and I know if you wanted to create some more humidity, you could always put like a bag over your pot in order to create more humidity. And in the later resources, there's a resource on how to make like a mini greenhouse. So you can use some of those techniques as well if you want to try to grow some tropical stuff in New York.
I'm going to unmute for a second because we are getting so many questions about organic versus not organic. So maybe before we carry on, why don't we address that now?
Okay. So organic is basically referring to the practice in which it is grown. So not using any herbicides or not using any pesticides. But there is a more, I guess, formal classification of organic that the USDA responds to, which is like 7 years at least without using pesticides or herbicides. But when we talk about organic practices, we really just talk about not using those chemicals and using more of the natural things to grow. So it could be organic, or it could be from your local community garden that doesn't use any pesticides or herbicides. And the reason why we want that is because a lot of fruits and vegetables that have seeds that are genetically modified are modified to not reproduce. So that means that it doesn't matter how many of them you put in the ground or how many of them you put in really great compost, use the black gold, is not going to grow.
Yeah, it's kind of it's hard to, because there's organic and then there's genetically modified, and those are two very different but related like definitions. But if you are getting a piece of organic produce, that, to my understanding, means that it has not been genetically modified to be sterile. So usually the stuff that you're buying, if it's organic produce, that means it's not been genetically modified. So it's more likely to sprout. Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, okay, let's just jump ahead to the beans, right? So beans are really cool because they are seeds, right? And we use a similar method that Laura did with the lemon seeds, where we sprout some dried beans in a wet paper towel. This is just to make sure that we know the germination rate, right? But just make sure that you aren't soaking them. So we are using a wet paper towel to like mimic germination, but we're not soaking them in water, right? Because if we do that, it's more likely that the beans are going to rot. Another thing to make sure is that it's not too old, right? And so now we're going to introduce something called heirlooms, right? And so an heirloom is essentially a seed that comes from an open pollinated plant that is passing on similar characteristics and traits from the parent plant to the child plant, right? And even that definition varies from gardener to gardener. So just remember that just heirloom just refers to the heritage of the plant. You know exactly where it came from. And then like we talked about earlier, organic refers to the actual growing practice, how you are growing the food. And in the next slide, we have just the simple germination technique. So making sure that we have the wet paper towel, putting the beans in there, closing it up, putting the lid on it. It's really that simple.
Yeah, and this was my experiment I did last week to see. I kind of mixed I had 3 types of beans that I was gonna try to sprout from. And these chickpeas in here I knew were super old. I found them in there from like a couple of years ago. So I didn't have very high hopes for them. But these other ones, these are cattle beans, which is an heirloom variety that I got from the farmer's market in New York City at a green market. And the black beans were just from my like local grocery store, but they're both a little more recent, so I had more hope for them. And those ones did sprout, and the chickpeas just got really moldy and disgusting. So the beans are they're prone to rot. So if you don't check them every day, then it might, I like forgot to check for a couple of days and they ended up being a little moldy, but some of them sprouted.
Right. Another cool thing is that in the previous picture, Laura had the date put on there. So like after a week or two, if you come back to it, you've been checking it every day, none of them have sprouted even a little bit, the likelihood that if you plant them, that they're going to germinate is like 0. So that might mean to move forward and try to get some different beans or different seeds.
Yes.
And here in this slide is just a simple, I guess, blow by blow of how to germinate seeds, right? So we talked a lot about the paper towels. So it's really simple, really easy, just tearing it in half and moistening one half. Kristen likes to say to think about it like a dried out sponge, right? So it's not soaking wet, but it is wet enough to germinate the seeds. And making sure that you're placing 4 or 5 seeds on half of the paper and then folding it over. You could use a Ziploc bag. You could use a Tupperware like Laura did with the beans. So, yeah. And yeah, just making sure they're spread out evenly. And now we're gonna move forward to the potato, which is my favorite vegetable. Just because potatoes are really easy. They come from a potato. So just like a bean comes from a bean, a potato comes from a potato. And you know, guys, if you ever left it in your pantry for too long, you might have seen these sprouts coming out and been like, what is this? So that's just a potato kind of saying like, hey, I think I'm gonna grow another potato, right? And they're also like the fourth most important crop overall, which is not that surprising to me. And you can use this technique with all different varieties of potatoes, all different tubers, really get to play around with potatoes. And so the next slide is really a step-by-step of how you're going to grow these potatoes. And so we took this picture from our teaching garden in Governor's Island. They're growing some potatoes out there. And so on the first picture, we see the potatoes cut up. And the reason why we want to do that is because we want to make sure that we're preventing any rot. We want to make sure that we're preventing any disease, right? So where we saw all of those little eyes, all those sprouts popping up, every slice has a sprout, right? And so in the next picture, we see our sprout is facing upwards, right? And so that is where the plant is, that's where the stem of the plant is going to come from. So you don't want to have the eyes facing downwards, because the potato is just going to, the stem is just going to go in a circle just to try to reach the soil. So we don't want to put any extra energy. We want all the energy to kind of go into reaching the surface of the soil, right? And then the third picture, we see like a little shallow little grave for our potatoes. So you don't have to bury them that deep, which is awesome, because that means that when you grow them at home, you can use a relatively large container, say about a milk crate size, right? Or you can even, if you have like a sunny fence, have them hanging in like a burlap sack on a sunny fence. But just don't fill the sack all the way up. Don't fill the container all the way up with soil. And the reason why you don't want to have it filled all the way up is because as the potato starts to grow and the leaves start to come out, you can do a really cool thing where you add more soil on top of it. And what that does is it tricks the potato into thinking that it needs to produce more potatoes. So we're basically telling it, work a little bit harder, make some more potatoes, and it does it, right? And so just understanding that although the potatoes don't need full sun, it's also not going to be happy in full shade either. So if we are using a milk crate indoors, making sure that we're using a grow light so it can have some sun, right? Yeah, and that's basically the gist of growing potatoes. And like I said, it works with all potatoes and all types of tubers. So it's the same technique for every different type of potato. And then we're going to move forward to a popular garnish that a lot of us use, which is garlic. Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about the garlic?
Sure. So this is something else that you might have noticed growing without trying. If you opened up your pantry and you realized like, oh, these things are actually still alive. So this is kind of cool because each garlic clove, which are the little like pieces that make up the bulb, each of those cloves has the potential to grow an entire bulb of garlic. This is something that you can grow indoors or outdoors. They both have different, depending on where you're growing it, you'll have different methods for planting them. But for outdoors in New York, what you do is you can actually just take each of these cloves, plant them outside in the fall, and then they're really low maintenance, and you kind of just let them grow for 8 to 10 months, and you'll be able to harvest them the following summer. If you're doing it indoors, you can kind of start at any time of year. It'll still take 8 to 10 months, but you'll plant them in a deep container and then wait for them to grow that way. If you don't want to wait the 8 to 10 months, you can actually get garlic greens, which are known as garlic scapes, after just a few weeks of growth. So you can do like the short-term harvest or kind of wait longer for the payoff of the entire bulb. Garlic contains a bunch of really cool stuff, and it's very healthy for you. So you got manganese, vitamin B6, vitamin C, fiber, a lot of good stuff in there. Yeah, and so let's see. This next one shows a little more of how to grow each indoors and outdoors.
Yeah, so we want to make sure that the pot that we're using, I know a lot of us use the terracotta pots, making sure they're at least 8 to 10 inches deep minimum. If we are focusing only on getting the garlic scapes out of it, right? So you're like, I don't want a whole bulb, I just want the garlic scapes, making sure that we're planting the cloves closely together. But if we want an entire garlic bulb, making sure that there's a 4 inch gap between each clove, right? And no matter if you're planting indoors or outdoors, making sure that the pointed side is always facing upwards and the root side is always facing downwards. Remember we talked about with the potato, it kind of going around in a circle just to breach the soil. So that's the same idea. And now we're gonna move on to ginger. So ginger is super awesome. Laura, you could lead us through this ginger one.
Okay, yeah, so this one, again, if we're talking about New York, you can't really grow them outdoors because it'll get too cold in the winter. You could always grow it partly outdoors and then bring it inside for the winter, or you could just grow it completely indoors as well. And it makes a really cool house plant. Ginger, everyone is like using it for different medicinal purposes, so it helps with immunity, digestion, inflammation, and a lot of other medicinal uses. You can make tea, you can cook with it, you can cook with the leaves if you don't want to wait for the entire rhizome to grow. Chantel, do you have the definition of a rhizome? I can never remember it exactly.
So a rhizome is anything that is continuously growing a horizontal stem and then it puts out these lateral shoots. So other definitions, if you want to visualize it, would be like asparagus, lily of the valley, turmeric, and even bamboo. So this technique, the next technique that we're going to show you guys, you can also do with turmeric. So that's also really awesome. So the first step essentially is just breaking it apart, right? Trying to figure out how much ginger do I actually want to grow, right? So 2 or 3 pieces should suffice. And then the next step is taking a knife and digging a hole for each piece that's in those little nodes that you can see the arrow pointing at, right? That's about 2 or 4 inches deep, and placing the rhizome with the sprouts and the nodes facing upwards. So it's the same technique that we talked about with the potatoes and with the garlic, making sure that things don't have to kind of go around. Wherever the stem is coming from, that's where we want to be facing upwards. And then the third step, which is the easiest, is just basically covering it with the soil and watering it. And then the fourth step is harder. Why? Because we have to have patience. Okay. And so just like with the garlic, is going to take some time for it to grow, right? So just make sure that you're keeping on top of the watering so the soil is moist but not overly wet. What's going to happen if it's too wet is that the ginger sprouts are just going to rot, right? But the really great thing about this ginger is that before they do sprout, they don't need any light. So you could just go for like the warmest place in your house, and then after they sprout, you move them to like a grow lamp if you have it, or next to a window where you get a lot of sun. And let's say you're like, okay, Chantel, you gave me a hack for the garlic. Let me get a hack for the ginger. How do I get some ginger if I don't want to wait 8 to 10 months? So say you're like 4 months in and you're like, I need the ginger. You can harvest some of it. It's going to be young. It's not going to be as flavorful. So you see here in step 4, there's a little bit of space between each of like the ginger sprouts. And so you're just going to reach your finger down about 2 inches from the leaf of the plant. You're going to have a little knife with you, and then you're just going to cut off a little piece, right? So, but don't blame me if it's not as flavorful. Maybe take Laura's earlier tip to use some of the ginger greens to make a tea if that is the purpose for it. And now we're going to move on to something that's really cool to do, which is water propagation. And so water propagation is basically using water as a medium to root plant cuttings. So you don't need any seeds. You can multiply your herb cuttings, and it works with a lot of different stuff. Scallions, succulents, pothos, but it's a little different for each of them, right? So let's talk about a little bit about the scallions first. So with the scallions, we want to make sure that it has the root, right? Without the root, you're not going to be able to use the water propagation technique. And it's going to regrow greens. You can keep them in your fridge for a little while. But Laura, didn't you do this technique? So I know you have a disclaimer
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah. Well, so for this one, the way that I do it is I'll buy scallions from a market, and then I will cut off the tops and just use the greens for cooking one night. And then the way that I store them in the fridge is put them in this glass with water in it, and the greens will start to regrow. After like a week or so, you'll have like a fully grown scallion again. You can do it up to about 5 times, although each time it grows back, it'll get a little less green because it's not in the soil with all those like extra nutrients. So I usually end up regrowing them 2 or 3 times, and then I'll just go ahead and use the whole thing. But it's great because it kind of saves you a trip and you get to have more scallion greens than what you actually bought.
Yeah, great money saving tip. And like the other things, these things work for like leeks and lettuce, as long as the lettuce has the roots. Carrot tops, beet greens, celery, even pineapple tops. I know the chat is like, Chantel, what am I doing with carrot tops? With pineapple tops. So a lot of people use the carrot tops to make pesto. You know, the beet greens are really high in nutrients. You can saute them, you can put them in your smoothies. And then the pineapple greens, which I just learned about, you can use to make a tea with it. And also people use it for like a lot of like crafts. So say you want to do some craft stuff with your kids, or you just want to explore using different food stuff for crafts, you can use pineapple greens for it as well.
Can you guys just tell us, do you need to change the water? That question is coming in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I should have definitely mentioned that. If you don't change the water whenever you're doing these kinds of propagation, it just gets slimy and murky and kind of gross. So like with the scallion greens, every couple of days, I'll pour out the water and put in fresh water. And that also helps a lot, even because when you add the fresh water in, that adds oxygen to the water, like some fresh oxygen that the plants actually need, or that it helps like the bubbles help them keep growing and that kind of thing. And so even, I'll go back to this picture. On the right, you'll see this is a pothos plant that I have. And I have to make sure I change this water out at least once a week. And as long as I do that, it just stays alive and stays pretty happy. But for these ones, yeah, you want to do it every couple of days for food stuff.
Yeah, and you guys don't have to add anything else to it, just water. Just water is fine.
There's a lot of questions about why you put them in the refrigerator versus a windowsill.
It would probably still work in the windowsill as well. I'm not totally sure why I put it in the fridge, but they grow back really well there, and that's where I store the rest of my food.
It's part of the experimenting. We do what works.
Yeah, you could try in the windowsill as well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And these ones, you could also, these scallions who have all these roots and are growing, you could plant those in soil as well if you have a garden that you want to put them in.
Yeah. And next we're talking about some mint, which is one of the greatest herbs, in my opinion, just because it doesn't need full sun. I know a lot of other herbs need full sun, like basil, but mint you could kind of get away with having a little shady spot. And so what you want to do is use a cutting like Laura has here. It's about 5 inches long. As we can see in the picture, there are these nodes at the bottom where the leaves used to be. So we're gonna remove the bottom leaves, and then we're just basically gonna put it in a jar with some water. This one you can leave in a sunny window. Don't recommend putting this one in the refrigerator, just for reference. And about 2 to 4 weeks, the roots should grow in. So Laura, I know you had some success and failures with these herb propagations.
Yeah, so the cool thing about this one is, like as we said with the scallions, regrowing the greens works if they already have roots on them. But the cool thing with these herbs, like with mint and basil, is that you can actually trick the plant into creating roots. So you don't need to buy a plant that already has roots. This was actually just a package of mint that I bought at a grocery store. And what I did was remove the leaves that were down here because I want to trick the plant into growing roots here instead of the leaves. And the way you do that is literally just putting it in water in a jar by your windowsill. And it doesn't have a 100% success rate. I did this with 3 stems of mint, and 2 of them ended up growing these roots after about 3 or 4 weeks. And one of them just kind of rotted because it didn't like the conditions or something like that. So it's always good to do a couple at a time just because you're not going to have a 100% success rate.
Yeah. Just remember, guys, if it messes up, it's okay. Don't think, oh, I don't have a green thumb or I'm not a good gardener. Things happen, you know. Plants are like us. They're very fickle. They kind of do what they want to do. So we just have to give some room for error. And in the next slide, we're really doing the step-by-step of like how to transplant them. So just when they have 1 to 2 inches of roots, I know Laura had the most success when it was about 1 inch. If it's 2 inches for the roots, it's more susceptible to root rot. So trying to get it in there when they're longer, about that size that you see in that picture, and then planting 1 rooted stem per pot. So we did the multiple cuttings, right? And they were able to thrive together in 1 cup of water. They're not going to do the same thing if you plant them in soil. They're going to fight for nutrients. One's going to die and one's going to look like the majestic herb, you know? So just understanding that we want to avoid the overcrowding and just covering the entire root system with at least 2 inches of soil and keeping it in a sunny window. In this picture, we have the basil. Like I said before, basil loves full sun. So just understanding that when you're doing your propagation techniques, is understanding, does my herb like full sun? Can it stand partial shade? That's going to determine whether or not you should grow it or not.
We have questions again about changing the water.
Yes.
You have to change that water. And then when you put the stem into the water, do you want the water to cover the nodes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
so you can better see that in this picture actually. So I have at least 1 pair of nodes here, and I want to make sure that that is underwater. So you can see in here the bottom like couple of inches are in the water so that that node will be able to grow roots. You might also get roots from the very bottom of the stem, but you want to make sure at least half of the stem is in water.
People are also asking if this will work with rosemary and dill.
Yeah, I know for sure it will work with rosemary. A lot of the woody herbs, you just want to make sure that you're getting a fresh cutting. The stems aren't brown. If they're brown, it's less likely that you're going to get any roots coming out of there.
Yeah, with like rosemary and lavender, you want to, what Chantel just said, so look for the newest growth on your plant because that's going to have like a green, very flexible stem, and that makes it more adaptable to growing roots. But if you try to put like the wooden stem of rosemary in water, it's not going to do anything because the cell walls are too thick to grow anything from them.
And now we're gonna switch over to some experiment stuff. So Laura, you want to walk us through this?
Yeah, so as you might have gathered, we've been like kind of experimenting with different things to grow from home. And we've told you like some things work, some things don't. And some of the reasons that things will or won't work is depending on if you know where the seeds are coming from and if you know that they're at full maturity. So when I was saying like break open all your botanical fruits or produce that you have at home, see if you can find the seeds in there and do like a little investigation. You might know that like cucumbers, they have seeds on the inside, but they're translucent and like almost like very small and flat. And so that's because the cucumbers that we eat are immature fruits. So we eat them before they've actually fully matured. And so those seeds are not mature enough or fully formed to actually grow anything from. So if you want to grow from a cucumber, you have to actually wait for it to mature on the vine. It turns yellow. We wouldn't want to eat it at this point, but that's where you would harvest the seeds from. So we have like a little chart, I think, on the next slide or you might just want to Google before you start planting stuff if it's coming from a mature plant. Something else to keep in mind is like something like apples is kind of surprising because you can plant the seeds, but each seed in an apple has unique DNA. So even if you plant a a seed from a pink apple, pink lady apple, it could actually grow a different variety of apple from the seed. Most of the time it'll turn into a crab apple tree, but it's actually kind of a surprise. And so that's why like commercial farms for apples will graft apple trees, which is a whole nother conversation, in order to ensure that they're getting the correct variety that they want.
Exactly.
And then another reason that your seeds may or may not sprout, some of them do need to be dried first or undergo an aging process in order to be ready to germinate. So
Yeah.
this over here is a list of seeds that you can plant fresh, straight from the produce: peppers, avocado, grapes, citrus, and apple. But then there's these all other seeds that actually germinate better after they've been dried or fermented: tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, pumpkin, watermelon, eggplant, beans. So this
Yeah.
is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but you can always kind of look stuff up, do your research on it, and see what works.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is whether or not the seeds can be planted fresh or dry. We want to make sure that typically we're cleaning all of the seeds first, because
Especially
that
the avocados, that'll just get rotten and gross if you don't clean off all the avocado flesh.
exactly. And so we're cleaning them off. We're making sure that if we're storing them, it's in a cool or dry space. I know some people kind of store things in the refrigerator, or keep it in like a closet. Anything that you know is not going to get too hot or too muggy, because we don't want that extra moisture on the seeds. What it's going to do is it's going to develop mold, or it's going to rot, and it's just not going to reproduce. So why that is because like if the seeds are not completely dried out, and it works better when it's dried, the skin coat that acts as a seed protector will be easily removed. So we want to make sure that we're protecting that coat of the seed, whether they have to be dried or we could plant them fresh. So cleaning them and making sure that we're storing them correctly is going to give us the best germination rates.
Awesome. All right, and this is just one last little note about the success rate of your experiments that you're doing as you grow from food and from food scraps at home. You'll probably have better success with heirloom and organic produce, as Chantel mentioned earlier. So stuff that you find at green markets, that's an even better bet because you know that farmers in your like region have grown them with success. Um, and a lot of times, even at the green markets, like when I was planting ginger or turmeric, I went to a farmer who I knew was at green market and that they grow it so that they actually got really fresh cutting that even was ready to be planted right off the bat. So it's always good to kind of see what you have. It's always fun to try and do stuff from the grocery store as well. Like that's what I've been doing. But if you have the choice and you want to try to do something that will more likely work, go for heirloom and organic.
Yeah, definitely. Because remember, like we said, a lot of the stuff that is from the grocery store, if it doesn't say organic, it might not have viable seeds. It might be produced in order to be sterile. And it also has been exposed to some form of radiation. So just understanding that as we move forward, we're trying to grow things indoors, especially if we're going to try to eat these things and feed it to our families and feed ourselves with it, is that we know our sources and we're comfortable with them. And that's all, folks.
Okay, we have so many questions. So I have been reading as you've been submitting, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we can. We had a lot of questions about how deep to plant the garlic cloves in soil.
Oh, well, you don't have to plant them that deep. I think about 2 inches is sufficient. Normally, you want to put something as deep as how big it is. So if it's something that's really huge, you want to plant it, in a big, with a big, in a deep hole. But if it's something that's really small, shallow, and covering it, it should work fine.
And if you already have garlic that is sprouting at home, you could plant it so that just a little bit of the green tip is coming through the soil.
Mm-hmm.
People are also asking what kind of soil do you need to grow potatoes, and what kind of soil do you need to grow like the rhizomes like ginger or turmeric?
Well, I know potatoes aren't picky because they're basically the easiest thing to grow. So any type of soil that you have, don't like go outside and like dig up soil, obviously, because
From the park, yeah, that makes
yeah, you might not want to do that. Might have a lot of lead or other chemicals in it. So sourcing it from like a local nursery, or Home Depot, or if you have access to a community garden, maybe going in there and asking them, hey, can I take a bag full of soil? I know when I worked on the farm, a lot of people did that to grow stuff indoors. So
yeah, and for indoor planting, I always recommend getting like a light soil mix, so like a potting soil, because indoor, one of the biggest issues to plan for is making sure your stuff has good drainage. So getting a light potting soil is always a good way to go.
Yeah.
People are asking if you can like skim the garlic scapes, like if you can take that off and then still get garlic, or is it one or the other?
If you are planting for the bulb, more than likely you're going to get garlic scapes. But sometimes people just want to plant for the scapes, so you could kind of plant them closer together. It's like I said, it's an experiment. Sometimes the garlic kind of does what it wants to do.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure actually. I would have to look that up because I know I see them selling garlic scapes and I was like, does that ruin the rest of the garlic plant? I'm not 100% sure.
It doesn't ruin the rest of the garlic. When we grew, because a lot of times when I was growing at the farm, we would grow garlic as a cover crop. And so in the spring, we would come back and we would just cut and we would give out garlic scapes as far as like our first harvest.
Okay.
So it doesn't hurt the garlic bulb in any way.
Oh, okay, so you can have both. Best of both worlds.
There you go. And follow-up question to that is, how do you know when the garlic is ready to harvest?
Oh, well, the garlic usually takes about 8 to 10 months. And I know that the green stalk starts to turn brown. And so like it essentially starts to die, which is why people like cut the scapes. Because if you don't, then it'll just die with the entire stalk. And once it does that, then you could kind of pull it up, and then you have to let it dry. You have to cure it for a while. You have to hang it. There's a process, so that's something that also you should look into as far as how to cure your garlic.
Or you could eat it as like a fresh spring garlic too.
Yeah.
Even if you harvest it early, it'll still be some form of garlic that you can eat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about more traditional, like.
Yes. If you want to do the full process.
Yeah.
We have, so yes, we are recording this. There's so many questions. Yes, we know. This is all going to be on GrowNYC's distancelearningpage.org, and we're going to email it to you afterwards too. So we know it's a lot. We know you're going to want to go back and look this up as a resource. We had some questions about carrot tops. And if you regrow the carrot tops, are you just getting carrot tops, or are you also getting a carrot? And are you getting if you're not getting carrot, are you getting seeds from the carrot greens so that you can? I think this person wants a carrot.
I can tell, yes. So when you are propagating a carrot in the water in the fridge, all you're going to get regrown are the greens. So you're only going to get carrot tops. And what you can do is you can eat basically the whole carrot, just leave a tiny bit of that carrot root, or the orange part, and then you can cut off the greens and use that for some pesto, put it in a shallow bowl or a dish with water, and the greens will regrow. The actual root of the carrot, like the orange part, is not going to grow, and since that's not happening, neither will any of the seeds.
Okay, we've got cherries from a pit. Will cherries grow from a pit?
It depends. I
don't know I've never tried.
I don't know either. Fruit trees are really kind of particular. It's like its own thing. We can look into that and we can follow up.
Yeah,
that would have to be an experiment. I would just wash it really well, and then put it in a wet paper towel. Try the germination, see what happens. But I'd have to look that up.
I think the real question is, do you have room for a cherry tree? Potentially too.
In your house? Probably not. I don't know.
That's a very long-term experiment.
Yeah.
We also have a question about which veggies do you recommend transplanting outdoors in a garden versus just keeping them going inside?
I guess it would depend on equipment. Like if you have grow lights to do seed starting, and that's going to be also in the resources that we send you later in the blog post that goes through the whole thing on how to seed start and then transplanting it outdoors. It just would depend on what your equipment is set up like in the house. Some things are better for indoors, and some things just will grow better outdoors. But I don't know. I guess it depends on what it is that you want to do with it. Like, is it just, I just want to grow lettuce because I like salad, or is it like I want to grow cabbage, right? Probably don't want to grow cabbage indoors. Probably want to go outside.
Yeah, it's kind of just based on how much space you have outdoors, but kind of like the little water propagation ones, those are good for indoors. For like potatoes, they don't like to be transplanted, so wherever you plant them the first time, don't move them again.
Yeah, spinach too. Spinach doesn't like to be transplanted. There are some things that like to be direct seeded, and if you try to move them, they will die. So
yeah, and generally outdoors you'll have more sunlight because you don't have walls around it. So the ones that like the sun more, I'd recommend outside.
We just, a few weeks ago when we did the beginner gardener intensive, the seed starting workshop covered some of that. Like, what do you plant? What's okay to keep inside, and what do you need to transplant outside? And, you know, how do you determine which one? So that is on the distance learning page too. And according to Jackie, you can grow a cherry tree from a pit, and it's a really fun experiment. So highly endorsed by Jackie.
Okay, some cherries. It's almost cherry season at the green markets, I think.
We have questions about onions and when should he cut off the flower to use the seeds for next year?
So typically, if you are going to save seeds, the flower would have to dry out. So once it's completely dry, you would be able to cut it off and kind of move it with your finger. You'd be able to see the little seeds come out. But if the flower is still fresh, I would just leave it.
Okay. Somebody planted sweet potatoes, and when they harvested, there was a string of them connected. Is that the way they grow?
Yes, that's awesome.
That's kind of cool. I don't know if that's the way they grow, but they kind of do. I guess it depends, because I know some of the tubers have like these really long ends to them, and they might connect with one another. I think as long as it was edible, it's fine.
Yeah, it's probably, I'm guessing it's just like the root is connecting all of the different tubers to each other. So I think that's really cool. Yeah, I think that's expected.
And for all of our school gardeners out there, we had a school that planted sweet potatoes right before school closed, like the real time in June, like a year ago. And then when they came back, they harvested 90 pounds of sweet potatoes. They were just slowly growing all summer while school was out. So that's a really great thing to plant right before, you know, in normal times, like before school goes out for summer. Okay, so we have a question about, have we grown mushrooms from used coffee grounds? We did a workshop on mushroom growing like 2 years ago, and coffee grounds are great because I think we only use something like 2% of the nutrient base. But the problem with coffee is that because it's so nutrient dense, you're going to attract a lot of other organisms that are interested in your coffee grounds as well. And so one of the things that was recommended to use as a base for growing mushrooms was actually cardboard, because it's nutrient poor, but the mushrooms are fine with it. And so you're less likely to attract any kind of organism that's gonna spoil your mushrooms for you. So that was from Jake. That's a great question, Jake. But yeah, I mean, coffee is great. It's just that I love it, like a lot of other organisms love it. We have a question about strategies for fermenting tomato seeds.
Right. So I knew you guys were going to ask me that. And, I have not personally done any fermenting for the tomato seeds. So I put it as a resource in the blog post. There you go.
We have questions about when do you replant celery? So it's in the water now. When do you put it in the soil? It has a little bit of growth on the top, so some new greens, and it does have roots.
Okay. I think the same rule applies as far as like the 1 to 2 inches of root growth. You don't want it to get too long because then it's going to get root rot. So if you have some roots and it looks pretty long, I would say plant it now.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, we have time for a few more questions. So, will seeds of dwarf varieties grow dwarf plants? If I get seeds from a small lemon, for example, can I expect a tree I can grow indoors?
I would say I wouldn't bank on it, because even if it's a smaller lemon, it could still be from a normal tree. It just ended up being a small lemon, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's from a dwarf variety of a tree. And also, dwarf varieties of trees, they're I'm not sure that they're heirloom varieties, that it would have like the same characteristics in the seeds as it does in the parent plant. So if you really do want to make sure you're getting a dwarf lemon tree that will actually produce lemons, I would say go to a nursery and buy one that's already started for you.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great question to end on. Which of these experiments would be the easiest for beginners? There's a lot of stuff in here that's like not especially easy. So I think seed sprouting, like I've got some
too.
Yeah, scallions.
Scallions is the easiest one for me.
I have chia seeds going on my windowsill. I'll let you know how that goes in a few days. And then, I mean, if you were to do something like basil or mint, worst case scenario, by putting it in the water, all you've done is like extend the amount of time that it's a good way to like preserve it too.
Yeah.
And keep it fresher for a little bit longer. So I would say that that's like super easy. You can pick it up when you're shopping anyway. If it fails and your leaves dry out, you can make tea. So you got a win-win there. And worst case, if you have it in the water, it'll just keep them fresher for a little bit longer, even if you don't end up with roots. What else? Do you think there's something else that's easy that we could for beginners?
No, I think those are pretty easy, readily accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And you can kind of play it around. I see somebody that's really persistent in the chat that's like,
cabbage.
Can you do cabbage?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I haven't tried it. I've never tried water propagating cabbage. So I guess you could experiment if you happen to have the cabbage, but understand that it would have to have the roots in order to be able to be water propagated.
Okay, so Matthew is saying he tried cabbage and it took a very, very long time for very little growth. So yeah. And there's one more thing that came up earlier in the chat that I just want to address really quickly too, because a lot of us are trying these experiments, but we have kids and we have pets at home. I know I have a very curious cat who enjoys biting into all of my experiments. So somebody was asking if these experiments are safe for animals. I would say that varies very much depending on what you're trying to grow. So if you do have pets and if you do have kids at home, you may just want to do like a quick search online before you try your experiment out, just to make sure that it's safe for everybody in your home. So yes, we hope that this inspired you today to keep growing, to try something new. We know you're away from your gardens and you're missing them. So if you haven't already and you want to sign up for the rest of the summer series, you can go to our Eventbrite. We're going to send you the link after this as well. You'll be doing Rats with me in 2 weeks if you come back for the next one. This is all going to be posted on GrowNYCDistanceLearning.org, which, is an amazing resource, and I have to like pat our whole team on the back because it didn't exist in April. We have built everything on that page since April, so please take a look, and if you are a teacher and you want to share that out with your students and their families, we're going to be keeping that going all through the summer as well. And if you would like to support our work, donations are always greatly appreciated. We have a GoFundMe right now where all donations, large or small, no matter what it is being matched by Bank of America. So if you like our workshops and we want to keep them free and open to the public, like feel free to drop a donation on grownyc.org. Thank you so much. We're getting so much love in the chat. You know, it's always a pleasure to do this, and we're always so amazed that everyone's willing to come out and spend time with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you do any of these experiments at home and you want to email us like pictures of the results, you can always do that. We would love to see what you're growing on your windowsill. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for Rats in the Garden. So have a good night, everybody.